Peter Copping, welcome to SHOWstudio.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm glad to have you. I'm going to start obviously by asking about the present because you have so much on, and it's a real time of change. I think even still in fashion we move so fast, but actually, you're very new at the position you're in at Oscar de la Renta. You've done your autumn winter collection, resort, bridal, so you've set your stamp in a way, but still early days. Just tell me a bit about what is going on and your feeling at the moment within that position.
Obviously very excited to be in the house. I think we're going to make a good pairing. I think a lot of people said when I went there, oh, that seems like a really good appointment. It made sense that I was going to that house. I think we're going to talk about that a little later, but I'd been in Paris for a long time beforehand, so 20 years, and I'd never really thought that I'd live in the United States working in New York. But then at the same time, I was really happy to give my own life a challenge, and turn things upside down, challenge myself and go off to do something new. Obviously, Oscar de la Renta was a house that I was very familiar with and aware of it and admired it for a long time. And then when there was that possibility to go there, really to work with Oscar, that's what the plan was. That we first spoke about. It didn't pan out in that way because obviously Oscar passed away sooner than anticipated. So then I was kind of, I don't want to say by myself because I was well supported. There was a great team of people on board to help me with, and also my partner who was there in New York as well. But still, it was a big challenge, and it was a lot for me to do. And I think, in some ways, I didn't have that much time to do the first collection, but that can be difficult. But sometimes I think that's good. You just have to deal with it and get on with it, and don't overanalyze things. So that. Looking back at it, I think was a positive thing. And now going forward, I want to say I can take a little more time, but that's not really true either, because as you know, fashion goes so fast and we have to do a lot of collections per year, so there's never that much time to really stand back and think, where do I see this going, what do I want to do? So it's quite an organic process, really, I'd say.
I can imagine. You said something there that really interested me. You said, of course, it was a house that I was very aware of, and I'm interested, what was your view of Oscar de la Renta before you were appointed? How did you see the house?
Well, I suppose it's how I saw the house and how I saw Oscar as well, because I think there's the two things that are both very important. The house and the work that Oscar did was obviously, it's a very sophisticated woman. I think it's a woman who enjoys clothes, who embraces fashion. She'll walk into a room and I think she wants to be noticed. It's about colour, it's print, it's mixes of textiles, all those sort of things. So it's somebody who is confident in herself and enjoys dressing. And that's kind of pretty different to the house I was previously in at Nina Ricci, which was much more sort of confidential, intimate, soft. But then Oscar himself and who he was, and that's for sure, he was a very big personality and had a great social life, socialized, his clients were his friends, he moved in all sorts of different circles, with celebrities, with politicians in the States of both camps. So he definitely was, I think, a larger than life character. Unfortunately, again, we didn't really get that much time to spend time together. So he was an inspiration in himself, and I think beyond fashion there was probably a lot of things that we'd have shared in common.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love interiors and homes and gardens and all of those things that were important in Oscar's life. So
there's the two sides.
But at the same time, I am who I am. So and I'm just going to find my own way to design there and project my own personality. So that's what I think I want to do going forward. All but respecting what the house has always stood for.
It's very interesting then that you mentioned personality and the man, because I think that's something beyond aesthetic. That's a huge part of the House of Oscar de la Renta, this idea of a man who, you know, as you said, he was a big personality. And I wanted to ask, was that in any way intimidating? Because I have the impression from your career, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're not someone who has particularly courted fame or personal kind of, you haven't put yourself in those roles. You've always chosen, in a sense, to be behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Was that intimidating to step into those shoes?
No, I think you're very right with what you're saying. I don't know if it was really intimidating. I think it's something that I'm definitely capable of doing. You know, just for instance, part of the job is being out on the road and doing trunk shows and meeting clients, and that I find that very easy to do, and there's something quite pleasurable about it. I enjoy, you know, having such a close contact with clients and getting their feedback, and when you're in the department stores that the events are held with, you know, speaking to the sales team. So I enjoy meeting people, and I enjoy speaking with them. I mean, the red carpet, that's another thing, and that's not one thing that
that's not your
I'm
cup of tea.
still getting used to, and I don't know if I ever really will. But someone last night, they said, "Oh, I saw this photograph of you at the CFD Awards. You look really good. You look like you were enjoying yourself." And I thought, "Oh well, I'm obviously improving."
Good acting.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to ask a bit, because it feels like, I was going to ask later, but it's pertinent. I think you're seeing these kind of appointments a lot. You saw it at Gucci with the appointment of Alessandro Michele. Appointments from the salt mines and Julie Delibran at Sonia Rykiel. And I feel like, you know, there's so much talk for such a long time about kind of, you know, designers as celebrities and the star designer, and it feels like designers who've kind of really grafted are having a bit of a moment. And do you feel that as well?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something in that, but I think it's true. I think that somebody that has worked for a long time and really learnt the craft, obviously we all go to college and study, but I think it's once you're out and working, that's when you really get the experience that can be applied to a position like this. So coming to Oscar de la Renta, you know, I was bringing with me 20 years of experience in Paris, and I really do think that counts for something.
Of course. It's interesting as well, because a lot of the designers who I interview for this series, particularly I've noticed the very young ones, you know, who've kind of done very well very quickly, they don't refer to themselves as designers. They love calling themselves, you know, like brand directors or creative directors. And is that something that you feel, or is that a side that you don't particularly engage with?
No, I do. I mean, I consider myself a creative director because, yes, in touching on, obviously the main role is the designing of the collection, but beyond that there are so many different areas, and going forward, how do we want the stores to look? What will the ads be? So, and that's something I very, very much enjoy in the work that I do, that it's not just purely in the studio all day long looking at hemlines. You know, I want to touch on those other things that surround the product.
One thing I want to ask about before we kind of go back and talk more about your life is, you said in an interview that there's a difference between continuing a legacy and being reverent. It was a conversation I think you had with Tim Blanks, and just explain that to me a little bit more.
Well, I think it's important. Personally, I think there's different ways of looking at that, and when I go to a house, I really want to try and go back and decide what the real essence of it was, has been, and that was very much what I wanted to do with Nina Ricci, for example, and the same Oscar. I think the house still feels very, very relevant. I'm not arriving in a house that feels broken and needs to be revived. So what I have to look at now is then, you know, how it can evolve and how it can be broadened and speak to new people. I also don't want to alienate an existing client, because I think a lot of women are very attached to the house, you know, and who is it for me to just walk in there and just think, well, I'm going to turn this house on its head and bring in a lot of new clients and completely forget the past history. So all of that's important for me. But, you know, fashion, it's a competitive industry.
Yeah.
So you have to stand out, you have to make noise. And I think it's all of those things that I have to assess now. And that's for sure, sometimes I will have to throw elements in there that don't seem to fit. And I think it's by putting sometimes those two things together, which at the end of the day will make it stronger, hopefully.
Of course. It's interesting, you kind of touched on it there, these fashion appointments that we see so often, is often they are wrapped up in some sort of animosity. An old designer is out, a new designer is in, a new camp is in, whereas it was an unusual appointment in many ways, because obviously, as you mentioned, you know, Mr. De La Renta did pass away, but you did have the blessing of him, and the intention was there for you to work together. And in a way, you must, I suppose, feel like you have more of a license, therefore, to kind of be experimental because you have that blessing, but then more of a personal ode to him.
Kind of both in a way, because I feel then if I stick quite closely to the house, that makes sense as well, because having been selected by Oscar. But I think he obviously had a confidence in me. He admired the work that I'd done in the past. So I think, he showed an element of trust. And that's nice to know, and it gives me definitely a sense of comfort in some ways. Yeah,
it's interesting, that sense of comfort, because it must be strange looking. I know designers don't often like talking about what other designers are up to, but it must be strange looking across and seeing what someone like Eddie Slimane is doing at Saint Laurent, or even J.W. Anderson at Loewe, and there's such a different pressure there, and such a different way of doing it.
Absolutely. The one thing I do think with those houses that they're obviously part of very big groups.
Of course,
So behind them they have large marketing teams, a lot of money for communication, so they can really get their message out there really fast and to a lot of people. Oscar, yes, it's a big house in some ways, but small in comparison to those ones. So I think we just have to develop somehow at a slower pace, which is a different way of doing things. And I think that will be a nice way to do it as well.
And a respectful way, I suppose. As well.
Exactly. But, you know, talking about Hedy, when you look there, I do think there are a lot of, you know, all the house codes are there still, but really repackaged and just to appeal to a much younger clientele.
Well, a lot of it's in the branding, isn't it? Exactly as you say. It's kind of
absolutely. But just some of the clothes, when you look at it, I can see, I've seen what you've referenced there.
That's something, it's interesting, you seem to have kind of respect for what he's doing. And one thing, again, I was going to ask later, I was interested to talk about designers who you admire, because I read in an interview that you had a bit of a penchant for Mead & Kirchhoff, which I don't know why it really surprised me. You said that you really liked what they did. Tell me about some of the designers you admire.
I always liked the exuberance of it, and just the decoration and the amount of things going on in one outfit really appealed to me. I liked it that I always liked the way they dressed themselves. I liked it when they'd come out at the end of the catwalk after the show, and just the look was like, we don't want to be here. And it was there's something appealing about it. But I liked their product a lot, and I think also the total look was incredibly eccentric and very pushed. But those pieces, isolated and pared down and worn in different ways, were really kind of nice pieces of clothing. I was just looking on Instagram at the big wedding that took place in Rome.
Florence.
And there was a few girls there that were wearing pieces from their collection, and just in that context, again, it came to life again and looked completely right.
Talking of them, do you feel, because when I was reading past interviews with you and past profiles, you know, words that continue to come up are things like, you know, femininity and prettiness, and I wonder, eccentricity doesn't often come up, which is something that perversely comes up with most other designers when you read profiles. Would you say you are eccentric?
I think I've got an element of eccentricity. I don't think it's necessarily something that comes through in my work, and it's probably not been applicable to the places I've worked.
It's interesting you're talking about things being applicable, because I think something that doesn't get mentioned enough with the skill of being a designer is an ability to work very well to a brief. We often talk about being a skilled designer as, tirelessly following your vision wherever you are, but that notion of actually maybe not pouring yourself into the clothes, but pouring yourself into following a brief or sort of doing something that's right for a house. Is that one of your biggest skills, do you feel?
Yeah, and it's also getting the balance right, because with some of my last collections at Oscar, I'll look at the pieces and think, I'm really happy with that. I think it represents me very well, and it's something that I personally like. There's other pieces that I like them and I think, wow, that really looks like an Oscar de la Renta dress, and almost like it could have always existed.
Yeah.
And I think that's good to be able to achieve that in some ways, especially at the moment when it's still very fresh.
Let's talk a bit about kind of that trajectory and how you've come to this position, because I want to go right back. We've talked a lot about the present, but you as a young boy and growing up, because you grew up in Oxford, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
What were you like as a child?
In the countryside. Nice. We lived just outside Oxford, so had quite an idyllic childhood, I'd have to say. My father, he was in the Air Force, so he was travelling a lot, so kind of absent and back on weekends, although when he was back on the weekend, it used to be we'd be doing tons of things together, whether or not it was out visiting something, or we had lots of animals, horses and dogs, and he'd be helping us to rise at the trot on the horses, and all those sort of things. So
Sounds perfect.
That was really great, and it was quite. We shared a house, and one half was our family, and the other half was my grandmother.
Right.
So, I did have those role models like my grandmother, and I know that's something that's always quite often said about designers.
Yeah.
We'll talk about, and she was a chic lady, but a chic lady in the countryside outside of Oxford. So it was Windsmore suits, nice little twin sets and things like that. But from an early age, I always knew I was very observant, very aware of how things looked, and just aesthetics in general, and not just related to fashion. It could be antiques or homes or anything. And there we used to have formed like a little collection of antiques when I was about 9, which I used to buy in the local antique shop that was actually in the village, and I dropped by there after school and go in, and it was run by two old ladies, and just spend hours in there talking to them and looking at things, and then getting pocket money together and going to make really small purchases, and some of them I still have today. So I know I just definitely had a curious mind, and that was something that was very much encouraged by my parents, and I feel very lucky to have had them, because when I sort of realised in myself that yes, I did want to pursue fashion, there was never any resistance from them about it.
And what was that point where that happened, that decided fashion?
Probably quite early on, maybe around early teens or something like that. And at that time, then my mother said, it's way too boring out here for you and your sister, we're going to move into the city centre of Oxford. So then we did move into Oxford, and I don't know if you know Oxford.
Yeah, I studied at Oxford,
really?
So I know it really well.
Where were you?
I went to Oxford University, went to Christ Church.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so right in the middle.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it?
Beautiful, yeah.
And it was an amazing place, an amazing environment to grow up in.
Yeah.
And I just really loved being there, but also so some of my parents' friends were the academics from the university, and they were pushing their children, into medicine or literature or whatever. But my sister and I never encountered that. So once we knew that we wanted to go to art college, it was really embraced, and we were given all the encouragement we needed.
And do you remember the first piece of fashion that you ever made?
Well, again, bit of a cliche, but sort of making dresses for dolls of my sisters, and I was talking about that with my sister the other day, and she said, "No, but that's all wrong. They weren't her dolls. They were actually my dolls." So my parents, they didn't mind the idea of me having dolls and playing with those, because think about a young boy who's interested in fashion, and when he sees a Barbie doll,
Yeah, exactly.
all those frills and everything, it's kind of quite appealing. So.
And did you enjoy school? Did you enjoy spending time
I enjoyed school. I enjoyed lots of aspects of it. Obviously art, history, English, all of that I really enjoyed. Kind of veered away more from maths and physics. Sport, obviously not one of my fortes as well.
It's interesting though, because it seems like you could have gone in many directions. It feels like you could have gone into interior design, or you could have. And I'm interested.
No, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Or antiques. That was something that was really appealing to me. Film as well. I kind of considered that. So
why did fashion win in a way? Were you starting to read magazines? Was it just the clothing?
Definitely, yeah. Because if you consider this was kind of mid-80s, so I think fashion in London, it was really appealing time. At that point, so and there's just something that came together there, and I decided it was fashion. Also, from quite an early age, I used to go up to London. My parents used to let just a friend and I go up to London on the bus and spend the day there. And I was just thinking back on it, how lucky I was to have experienced that. I mean, if I was a parent now, I don't think I'd allow a 13-year-old to go up to London on their own, but I think it was something that really allowed me to grow and see the world, and that's one of the reasons I don't think, I was happy to then leave, go to London to St Martin's, and then beyond that to go to London, to go to Paris and work there, and even now just to, after 20 years, have a big life change and go to set up in New York.
Yeah, there's definitely a kind of a sense of adventurousness to your career. I think you have moved around a lot, and do you think that comes from that?
Kind of moved around a lot, but then been quite loyal as well.
Yeah,
the longest period was 12 years with Marc Jacobs. So, there in that role I felt really fulfilled. And it was probably just at the end of 12 years, I was thinking, I think it's time to move on and do something else.
And tell me more about that process of kind of aspiring to move to London and moving to London. I'm interested in kind of, you mentioned going there on trips, but also you must have been seeing things coming out of that. I've read in interviews before, you've cited people like Catherine Hamnett. You were very interested in their work.
No, completely. And I can remember, I used to go up to London when she had a sample sales and stay in line for hours to get in, and also then Brown's on South Moulton Street. That was a mythic place, and I can remember the first time again when I went up there and just entering the store and just looking at things and being really excited about it. And that was all before I was even on foundation course. Also, before I did my foundation course, I wrote to some designers and asked if I could do placement. So,
do you remember who you wrote to?
Yeah, but you said that I'm kind of don't really put myself out there, and I think that's true. But at the same time, I am quite driven.
Yeah, of course.
So I did write these letters. One was to Pam Hogg, and the other one was to John Galliano, and I arranged summer placements with them for a couple of weeks over the holidays before starting on the foundation course.
Tell me about that time. That must have been fantastic.
Yeah, so I went up to London. I stayed with a friend while I was doing. I think I did 2 weeks with Pam Hogg and 2 weeks with John.
It's amazing.
It's a brilliant time, and obviously they were quite small companies, so it had to be quite hands-on.
Do you think that kind of set in motion almost straight away that idea that you would always work for someone? I wondered where that idea of not having your own label came.
Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I think it's probably just how it panned out in a way.
Was it ever a consideration?
Not really, but when I was at the Royal College, for example, there with two other fellow students, we really decided to work in a different way, and we did a collaboration.
Yeah.
It was with John Ray, who's now at Dunhill, and April Crichton, who's Rory's sister. I saw his box on the shelf there.
Yeah.
And we decided to do a collaboration. We didn't do an individual show, so that was kind of quite different at the time, because in general, people would use that final collection at St Martin's just to promote themselves, but we wanted to do this collaboration. We felt our work worked well together and touched different sort of people. And even at that time, the collection that I designed was much more towards a more sophisticated woman and quite a mature woman as well, even to the extent that we did all our own castings and found our models. We found sponsorship as well. We got sponsorship from Pernod. So that, in a way, how we put that together and how we looked for a backer would have been, the most logical step would have been to set up our own business on leaving college. But maybe that didn't happen because John and we went on to the Royal College to continue studying. But it would have definitely made sense to have formed a company out of that. But it was never really thought about or spoken about. So I guess in retrospect, it wasn't really something I was really thinking about.
You said
The other thing I want to say is also at that time, all the French houses had real appeal to me.
Yeah.
And we used to go, as students, we used to go over to Paris to attend the fashion shows, which was completely brilliant. And we saw amazing shows and an amazing time for fashion, I think, if you consider it was when Yoji and Com were really just hitting the scene.
Do you remember any standout shows?
Oh God, there was. I had to say some of the Gaultier shows at that period were absolutely fantastic. There was one where the models were on a moving conveyor belt and they didn't walk; they just walked and struck a pose on this moving conveyor belt. And
fantastic.
At that time when you were there witnessing that show, you thought you were at the centre of the earth, basically.
Of course, yeah.
And what was that I wanted to say? I can't really remember.
One thing I was going to ask a bit more was about sort of that time in London and that time of it being, because a lot of people speak about knowing they had to be in London. They talk about the time of it being so experimental.
Yeah.
They talk about club culture, but it feels like maybe just what you said there. It feels like maybe for you Paris signified more of a kind of it.
And that's in fact what I wanted to say. And I kind of identified it was all what was happening in Paris that was really exciting to me. Much as I loved everything that was happening in London, like Catherine Hamnet and Body Map and Lee Barry and all of that scene, but that level of sophistication that you could find in Paris really appealed to me. Again, to kind of show my driven side, when I was at the Royal College, I had a Saturday job in the Conran shop, and at one point Christian Lacroix came in shopping with his wife, and his company had just been going for a couple of years at that point, and he was, he was everything to me. I just loved that whole look. So I just thought, I'm not letting this opportunity pass me by. So I went and spoke to him and explained I was a student at the Royal College and would there be any way of coming to work for him. We're doing an internship. So he said, yeah, send me some work and a letter and we'll see what we can do. So, on Monday there was a letter in the post with an example of my work, and then a couple of months later I got a call from the directress of the Haute Couture salon asking me to come over and work with them.
And that must have been just fantastic.
Yeah.
Tell me about that time.
I went over during the Haute Couture and I had, it was best I illustrate quite nicely and have quite a good hand, so that's what had appealed to them in the work that I'd sent. So what I had to do is illustrate the couture collection, because Christian would do the designs himself, obviously, but then through the fitting process, sometimes the original design to how it was shown and represented on the catwalk would change. So I had to do kind of an illustration of how it was shown, plus put fabric samples on, and this was a big dossier that was in the couture salon for the sales afterwards. And then I also designed variations around some of the outfits. So if a jacket had been presented with pants, I'd draw it with skirts, and some of the evening dresses I'd adapt them for wedding dresses. So, and all of this because I had to know what was happening in the fittings, so I could do an accurate drawing. I just had to basically sit alongside him, getting these illustrations done. So it was such a learning curve to watch someone like Christian work.
But I also guess it's very interesting to have that very early experience of kind of that real creativity, but also that seems like a lot of your role was involved in the commerce aspect of it, which must have been quite illuminating.
Yeah, so that was definitely an eye opener, and it was interesting to see how they did make couture into a business for them. But beyond that, just to witness Monsieur Lesage coming in and opening embroideries and presenting them to Christian, you know, that's something that I'll always remember and feel privileged to have been part of. Just the fabrics he was working with, the combinations of colours, everything was incredible. You know, sitting watching a fitting on Mary Sesnick, you know, it was kind of incredible. So and they invited me back 4 or 5 times to always do that same job.
And it must be strange, given what we talked about right at the start, you know, and it's something people always bring up in this series, which is that kind of punishing pace of fashion and the quantity of collections that we do and the expectations that are on designers now. Is it ever hard not to feel nostalgic for that time?
Yeah, definitely, I guess. And also when I started at Louis Vuitton, you know, we did 2 collections per year.
Of course.
So consider that, you have 6 months to develop a collection, which is, you know, it's kind of quite self-indulgent, really.
Yeah.
I didn't know if it necessarily made the collections better. I think there's something, a lot of people complain about the pace and the intensity of it, but a lot of designers are made up in a certain way that, you know, their brains are and minds are going very fast.
Of course.
And already, you know, I've just finished the resort collection, so yes, we have to get on with the next one, but even before that I was already starting to think of things and feeling like I wanted to look at new inspiration, to look at the fabrics for the season, to just get going on it.
And tell me a bit about that process that you mentioned, kind of being with L'Aquarelle, but that process where you did start kind of operating out of Paris. Was the realities of Paris as brilliant as the idea of Paris that you'd had as a boy in London?
Yeah, I'd have to say it pretty much lived up to it. On leaving the Royal College, I didn't go straight to Paris.
No.
I did a short period at Iceberg in Italy, and that was kind of quite a strange experience in some ways. I knew it wasn't where I wanted to be already, because it wasn't in one of the main cities. It was on small town on the Adriatic coast. So we did definitely feel quite cut off there. The thing that made it quite pleasant was just some other people from my college ended up there, so we were kind of a little group. It was near the beach and we had motorinos. So we were kind of living the
like
Italian Riviera life. But I really knew I wanted to get back to Paris. And then April, who I'd done my collection with at St. Martin's, was then working at Sonia Rykiel, and she managed to get me in there. So, you know, I felt elated to really arrive in Paris and be working there and on Boulevard Saint-Germain. And Sonia was very much part of the design process at that point. So, you know, having witnessed Le Croix work, then to be alongside Sonia and observe her, that was very, very inspirational as well.
And what was the point where you felt like you kind of sort of, I guess, kind of honed your aesthetic? Because a lot of people talk about it being when they're at college and when they're at St Martin's, how it's kind of pulled out of you, and the quantity of work you're expected to do there, and, you know, the pressure in a way. It does make you kind of work out what you're about. But did that happen more gradually for you, or on leaving college did you know? No,
I think I knew pretty well. You know, what appealed to me and where I wanted to go. Yeah, and I think you know, beyond that, everything still feels very much in line with those initial thoughts. So I think that is something I could say about myself. I quite clearly know what I like and can see where I'm going. And
is it ever hard to feel like you have to, you know, doing, as you mentioned, you know, that very long stint at Marc Jacobs and well, not at Marc Jacobs, at Vuitton, and with Marc Jacobs and Nina Ricci, do you ever feel like you have to kind of compromise your vision in any way?
Slightly, but never too much. I always feel that within the houses that I've worked, I've been able to express myself pretty fully. And obviously at Vuitton, you know, that was a 12-year period, but it was where I really grew a lot. I started with Marc when there was no ready-to-wear existed. So that, I think that's probably what allowed me to stay there for so long, because the line grew itself a lot, and as designers we all did as well. Marc too, I think he grew a lot through his time at Vuitton, and just what he came in there and experienced. And I think he enjoyed working with a French atelier and all those things that were to hand in Paris that he couldn't necessarily experience in New York.
It must have been strange for you going into that position in a sense, I imagine, because having worked somewhere like, you know, Le Croix or Sonia Rykiel, where you're working alongside someone where kind of the house is theirs and it's their blood, and also there is a sense, like, particularly obviously not Le Croix, but with Sonia Rykiel, where there is a kind of an archive in a sense, to going somewhere like Vuitton with Marc, where you were kind of all winging it in some ways because there's nothing to go on. Was that a big learning curve, I imagine?
Yeah, right. I guess it was. And you know, that first collection wasn't particularly well received, and it was. I have to say, it was a really beautiful collection. And when you look back at it, it was, you know, using the most beautiful fabrics, and there was some very subtle detail there, and a lot of things even inside the clothes that you couldn't perceive from the outside. So, but I think that collection had to be done in some ways to then find a different way to go forward.
Of course.
And then even with the second collection, you know, Marc felt much more comfortable, as we all did, to embrace the pattern and the monogram and start playing around with that. And I think, you know, as soon as that happened, then we all know what Marc did there. So he just went further and further, and had really great results.
And tell me, what sparked you mentioned kind of before you felt like it was time to leave, but what was it that was, I guess I'm trying to get to the bottom of you say you're kind of very driven and very ambitious, and maybe I want to understand what it is that drives you. Is it making beautiful clothes? Is it collaborating with interesting people? I think
at the end of the day, it really probably is the process and working with the team and you know, just making things and the design process. I still definitely get a buzz when I look at some pieces and think, yeah, that's exactly how I saw it. It's exactly what I wanted, and you know, have a real sense of pride. But I was there for that 12-year period, and Marc's very generous in terms that he delegates and he allows people to grow as well. So over the years, I became responsible for the cruise collection and the pre-fall. He even allowed me to be the spokesperson for the press for those 2 collections. So I guess it was from having done that then I was starting to feel like, well, yeah, I'm doing this here, but I didn't see anywhere further I could go. So it made sense to then kind of move up and then move on to Nina Ricci, where I was responsible for a line.
The line, yeah. And tell me about being there, because that was an interesting one, I guess, very different to Oscar de la Renta in a sense, where I think, there's such, as you say, he's so present still, and I think, he such a sort of, I guess, so in the popular consciousness, whereas I think it's a very niche set of people in fashion who would remember the original kind of Nina Ricci work and aesthetics. So very different appointment.
I mean, I came in there kind of at a tricky moment because Olivier had been there for a couple of years, and obviously they decided that something wasn't right, or they were looking for someone else. So I went in there, and I can remember, the first collections I design, and if I read reviews or bloggers, it would always be, oh, we miss Olivier, bring back Olivier.
Yeah, because there was so much press.
So that was kind of, it didn't really bother me at the end of the day, but it was something I was definitely aware of. And I think, 5 years, I was there for 5 years. So at the end of that 5 years, I'd made my mark there, and I think people appreciated it. I'd always say myself, I don't think it was a look necessarily for everyone, but I didn't want it to be that either. And then going forward and arriving in Oscar, I haven't had really any sense of that. I think there's just been a really good sense of well-being, and people are excited that I'm there, and have spoken very positively already about what I've done. So that, in some ways, I find myself in quite a nice position.
Of course, yeah. And I think what unites those 2 houses, and I think we talked about it at the start, I think a lot of the reason people felt like it was a very natural appointment was this kind of femininity that has always underpinned your work. And I'm interested, what is femininity to you? Is it something that's kind of unexplainable, or?
Well, let's try and explain that. But
tough question.
I think it can mean different things for different women. I don't necessarily think it means being dressed up in ruffles and lace. Obviously that's a more first degree sort of version of it. I think it comes through women who feel comfortable with themselves, who can express themselves quite openly and comfortably, and I think there's definitely sort of certain silhouettes for me that define it. I think when you can do something that's quite body conscious but doesn't feel vulgar in any way, that's one sort of way of defining femininity. But it can be a way a woman holds herself, certain gestures that come through her personality as well. And then, as I said at the beginning, there are all those sort of obvious things, whether or not it's colour palette or the sort of fabrics that you can use.
In fashion at the moment, we see so much talk about things like androgyny, or sort of, I guess, things that are very kind of progressive in their relationships with the genders. Would you say that what you do is in any way conservative, or maybe that's something conscious or something that you?
I think it's. I think it's relatively conservative. Yeah, because of you, I can't really think of an example, but yeah, there's obviously so many more people who are not conservative.
Yeah, exactly.
But
it's always conservative to be conservative.
I think, but then I'm always very aware of how something can look new and just feel contemporary, and that can come through, whether or not it's the way that the clothes are constructed, or the way they're put together, or just certain choices that you can make.
No, for sure. And let's talk a bit more. I think one of the things that really struck me, and I think it's really come across in this interview, is your passion that you had for being in France. I read a lovely thing, which is you said that when you started it at Nina Ricci, you put the addresses on the labels.
Exactly.
You deliberately kind of did it, which I thought was so lovely.
Yeah, because also they had this fantastic address. It was 39 Avenue Montaigne. Yeah. And I just didn't understand why they didn't celebrate that, because Avenue Montaigne, again, it's this mythic street in Paris. And when you walk along there, it's a bit like the road in Hollywood where you have the star signs. They actually have plaques in the pavement for the designers that had worked there in the past, or Vianney, who had her house there, or the Calusar. So I just thought that was something that needed to be celebrated and really put on the label. And I was quite happy to see on there the last fragrance that they just launched. It was, I think it's called L'Extase with, oh God, can't remember, Laetitia Casta. And the perfume bottle, they've used the label, it's been translated into metal, but it has the address on there. So in some ways, I thought, I wasn't part of that design process. I didn't work on that project. I was already left before it was started, but I thought, no, that's nice. Somewhere I've left my legacy there.
Yeah, of course. But it must have been hard, I think, because it seems like, you kind of know that French, not just the French aesthetic, but I guess the French sensibility, you kind of know it inside out. And to get used to a New York one, it is a different sensibility,
It is different.
feel.
And also the other thing is Oscar comes very much from a Latin culture. So before, it was very Gaelic for me, and here in something that has its roots in Hispanic and Latin culture, or Oscar had residences in the Caribbean as well. But again, like I said, I kind of like to give myself design challenges, and I think it's opened up a whole new world to me. I've inherited Oscar's library in the office, so there, just looking at the books that he has on his shelves is a real inspiration, and there's a lot on textiles and patchwork and American quilts and all those artisanal things which I love very much as well. I love textiles and of all different sorts, but it was never really something I could explore at Nina Ricci.
Of course.
There's a great selection of ethnic books that Oscar has as well, and none of the houses, well, we should have really been able to do it at Vuitton, but Mark had quite an aversion to it, so we never really went in that direction. We once did a research trip to India, and then it came back, and just through the process of designing it and working with Mark, no one would have ever thought we'd been to India as a starting point for this collection. So anything that referenced an ethnic culture, it would always get pretty much worked out in the design process at Vuitton.
Why do you think that was?
I just think it's something that didn't appeal to Mark, and that was fair enough. It was his vision for the house, and we were kind of happy to take inspiration from some of those places, but then rework it and mask it so it wouldn't become too apparent. And definitely didn't feel particularly relevant to do that for Nina Ricci either.
Yeah, absolutely. There must be an interesting challenge at Oscar de la Renta in a way.
So it's good, and already in the resort collection that we presented kind of a couple of weeks ago, there was definitely references to coming from some of those books that I found on Oscar's shelves. There was a leather coat and a skirt that came pretty directly from patterns I'd seen in books on American quilts. So that's all new territory for me, and I think after 20 years of working, to find yourself in that position,
it's a privilege in a way.
That's really great, and not to be looking at just the same starting points all the time. So I do feel things that have really opened up for me.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting, one thing I do want to talk about as well with Oscar de la Renta is this sense of who it appeals to, because I think there's, fashion is so often kind of like completely fetishizes youth and is obsessed with youth, but I think there's something interesting about your career from what you've just spoken about and Oscar de la Renta, and the fact that it appeals to women who aren't, your classic sort of incredibly slender, incredibly young woman who it feels like a lot of other high fashion is speaking to. And is that something that's always been a passion of you, that diversity in terms of age and making sure? Yeah,
definitely. And going back to this casting at St Martin's that we put together, there was a woman in my part of the collection, and she was 60 years old. So it's definitely always been something that's been on my radar. And talking about the trunk shows earlier, I really do like kind of going out on the road and meeting the women and seeing who they are and speaking to them.
And tell me about the plans for expansion, because I think branding and your business is such a huge part of fashion, and it feels like you're both very for it, but I've read things that hint in some ways are kind of, you said once that you thought the idea of an it bag was nauseating, and I thought that was quite great. And I wonder, how do you want to expand without kind of doing this?
I think looking at the company and where it is now, there's a number of ways we can do that. For example, in the Far East, there's very little presence of Oscar de la Renta at the moment. So that's a clientele who I think the brand can speak to. I think it's quite applicable to their tastes and their aesthetics. So that leaves a huge territory open for us. Just thinking back to Paris, we're not present there. There's obviously the home clientele in Paris, but then there's a lot of women visiting from outside. So that's another area we can build the brand, and also through the product itself. I think obviously not alienating the existing client, but broadening the offer, just making it feel a little fresher, a bit younger, drawing in new younger women is something that will be good for us. And then still thinking about the product, leather goods, shoes, jewellery. Leather goods is something that I think has to be balanced off against good day wear.
Of course.
And at the moment, I think probably a lot of people's association or the way that they think of Oscar is for cocktail or evening wear. And I think there's a history of having done really super sophisticated day wear in the past, but I want to ask myself, well, what can an Oscar de la Renta woman wear during the day, or if she's working? So those are all things I want to address. I think that will give more appeal. I think it will allow us to do credibly day wear bags, and that's where obviously you can make volume. But my own way of thinking of going forward, I don't think people necessarily want to see seasonal Oscar de la Renta bags.
No.
And I don't think it's necessary to think, well, every 6 months, or even, for each collection, if that was cruise, pre-fall, the 2 shows, that would be 4 times. Do we really have to do a new line of bags for each season? Personally, I don't think so, but I think it would be great to come up with something that just felt iconic and would have a longevity that we could just build on, adding in volumes and sometimes new shapes, but around just one line of bags, and allow it to exist for however many years. Well, first of all, you have to allow it time to work.
Exactly.
And sometimes that can take a number of years, especially as a smaller house, and what we touched on earlier, that we do have less communication budget, so we can make our point known kind of at a slower pace in some ways. So that's another reason for not changing too quickly.
And I guess embracing word of mouth as well, and letting
absolutely, And then I think just thinking of different ways to communicate, sort of more outside the box, and a less typical form of communication for a product like that.
Of course. And how do you balance this, I guess, with your personal ambitions? Because going back, I love this idea that we talked about quite a lot about you being driven, you being ambitious, and do you feel like you've kind of achieved what you want to achieve? Do you feel content, or are there lots of unfulfilled ambitions kind of bubbling away?
There's definitely things I'd like to do going forward, and I think probably even within the house it leaves me scope for that. Interiors are definitely something I'm very passionate about. And at Oscar there is a homeware line. So really initially my concern has just been for the clothing, and I've really focused on that and not got sidetracked with anything. But then going forward, when I can get more involved with that and be part of it, that's something that's going to be very exciting for me. So that's going to give me more fulfillment. But yeah, definitely at the moment I feel that there's more than enough to occupy myself with.
I'm sure there is. Peter, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.